All right. Good morning, church. Well, it's great to see you all for this lecture conversation on the book of Daniel. I've thoroughly enjoyed working through the prophets with you all, and I keep thinking, I don't know that this is that exciting, but you keep showing back up. So thanks for doing that and making this so much fun to do together. The pedagogy, the teaching style of this class has been lecture, and it's at a very high level. We're not getting into what each verse says. My goal here, sort of as a teacher, is so that if you want to go back and read, you have some understanding of what's going on. So I acknowledge in terms of a Bible study, this is much more of a broad overview than it would be if we sort of went chapter by chapter. But I'm hoping to equip you to be able to do that. Well, Daniel is the best name ever. It is a really important name in the scripture, and I am so excited to teach you about this book. Not only does it bear my name, I think it's just a powerful and awesome and cool book that I didn't know until I went to seminary, and then I loved my name more because of who this guy is and is portrayed to be. All right, I've told you in the past that the books of the Old Testament are put in a super weird order. They typically read the first line and then decide where in history it goes because of that first line. Do you remember that last week we talked about the three audiences of the text? There's the audience of the author, the time in which the author wrote. Then there's the audience that he wrote about, which means that it has already happened if he's writing about it. And then there's you and your audience, right? You're going to read these things differently than you would 100 years ago or 100 years from now. So all three of those are important people and histories, okay? So the audience of the writer is almost never the same as the audience about which they are writing. It's always later. You always write something later than when it happened. And today, I'm going to show you how you can use your brain to figure out how far removed the author is from the thing that they're writing about. And you can figure this out by how emotional and personal the thing that they're writing about is. In general, the more emotional and personal the thing is, the more recent it happened. Okay? You would write about the stock market crash very emotionally and personally if you wrote in 1939. You would write about it a little more objective, historical if you wrote about it in 2023. Do you see what I'm saying? Yeah? So we're going to see that show up in the book of Daniel. And once you realize that Daniel is a much later story than we give it credit for, you see it for what it really is, which is a really cool story. All right. A little bit of review. Our TV show is called The Hebrew Headaches. Season 1, their seminal, most important story is the escape from Egypt. This is the most important episode of Season 1 of the Old Testament. Okay? This is the story on which all of the other stories are built, not Genesis. Genesis is a prequel. It's a spin-off, if you will, of the original. Okay? The Genesis is Better Call Saul, right? It is not. I can't remember the name of the show now. What's the Breaking Bad. Okay, so Breaking Bad is the escape from Egypt. Better Call Saul is to Genesis. All right, that's a prequel. This is their story. This is the story that everything else comes back to: Moses, the covenant, the 10 Commandments, the promise of the land of milk and honey, the promise that God wants them to be faithful and to settle down and to worship only that God. That's season 1. Season 2, they start having kings. First king is Saul, and then David, and then Solomon. And after Solomon, there's a civil war, and they split up the northern kingdom from the southern kingdom. The northern kingdom leaves. Season 3, the northern kingdom gets attacked. We start to see how the world is getting bigger. The Assyrians come down. They sack the northern capital of Samaria, and they get all the way down to Judah and Jerusalem, and they try to sack Jerusalem, and they don't get to. That's the end of season 3. Season 4, the Babylonians conquer the Assyrians, and they make their way down. Now, like there are with all good movies, there are also books that accompany each of them. And if you really want to nerd out, you can read the books, but usually the movies are just as good. I'm kidding. I said that to provoke you, right? I'm a Harry Potter purist. Our children cannot see any movie until they've read the book and passed the test on do you understand what's happening before the movie shortens it, cuts out spew entirely, pretends like Percy isn't even one of the Weasleys. You see what I'm saying, right? If you want to get in depth into the TV show, The Hebrew Headaches, there are books of the Bible that accompany each of them. That's what I'm trying to show you in this. The Hebrew books for Jerusalem is Ruined are 2 Kings, 2 Chronicles, and Jeremiah. All right? This is what we talked about 2 weeks ago. And then the very last episode of season 4 is called Ezekiel. And Ezekiel's having his 30th birthday in captivity. The Babylonians have taken many of the rich, wealthy elite into Babylonian captivity. Ezekiel is one of them, and he talks about how if we don't change, the temple will be destroyed. And then while he's still a writer, 10 years later, the temple is destroyed. And he writes very poetically, very viscerally about the loss of the temple. That's the book of Ezekiel. That's season 4. This is as far as we've gotten so far. All right, season 5, I cut for time, okay? We're not going to talk a lot about season 5. This is the only mention of it, okay? And it is about King Cyrus of Persia, played by Billy Ray Cyrus, okay? Because his achy-breaky army makes it all the way up into Greece. In the very first lecture, I told you to go watch the movie 300. Did anybody watch the movie 300? You were all going to fail and repeat my class next year. My boys and I did watch the movie of 300. That movie, the battle there with King Leonidas, this is Sparta. You remember this guy? King Leonidas starts to turn the war in favor of the Greeks over the Persians. That's a historical, obviously they're all the best stories deserve to be exaggerated, but it's really important to understand historically that the Persians set the Jewish people free. When they sack Babylon, when they defeat Nebuchadnezzar's children, or successors, one of them's not his child, it's his son-in-law, who gets it by marrying his daughter. Anyway, the Persians are really good to the Jews. The Persians are really good rulers. None of the rest have been very good, okay? This is really important because the word that Isaiah uses to talk about Cyrus is the anointed one, the Messiah. In fact, our word that shows up in Greek, Kyrios, which means Lord, which means Christ. Christ etymologically is related to the word Kyrios, which means Christ or Lord or anointed one, which etymologically can be traced back to the word Cyrus. So the word Christ comes from the word Cyrus, we think. We don't really know anything, right? We think we know. We think we know that we know. We think that we know that we know that we know. We don't actually know anything. All of these is like what the best of what we can produce is, okay? So the first Christ, the first anointed one, the first Messiah is Billy Ray Cyrus. Any questions about that? Cyrus the Great is not only a great military conqueror, he does a decent job of humanitarian effort. He tells the Jewish people they can go home to Jerusalem, that they can worship their gods, and that he is going to incorporate their God into his pantheon of gods. That their God is going to be registered with the World God Trademark Federation. Okay? Which is kind of neat because everybody else has said, no, you cannot do your religion, you cannot do your language, you cannot do your culture, and you cannot live in your city. So Cyrus returns the people back to the land. They follow that same path that Abraham, later is written that Abraham travels, that same path from the land of Ur, the land of the Chaldeans, the land of the Babylonians, all the way up back down to Jerusalem so that they can resettle. The books, if you wanted to read the books for this season of the TV show, are Ezra, Nehemiah, and Micah. Ezra and Nehemiah is probably one book written by two people, but together. Ezra and Nehemiah is the story of the return home. It actually includes, if you really want to nerd out on the history, it includes part of the decree from Cyrus in it that says that the Jewish people shall return home. There is a piece of archaeology called the Cyrus Cylinder that you can look up on Wikipedia that mentions the Jewish people returning to Jerusalem, which is really neat because this city is not significant in the world scene. Most historians don't include it. It's a small backwoods town that has now been destroyed. So for it to be included suggests that Cyrus really does live up to his name, Cyrus the Great. He really does send them home. The story of Nehemiah says that he is maybe even a eunuch in the court of King Cyrus, and personally asks the king if he may return home. Cyrus is also a very interesting ruler because he tells people that they can do their own religion, but he suggests that everyone speak his language, which eventually becomes Aramaic, which is the language that Jesus spoke, which is another reason you could see that the word Christ would come from Cyrus, because that etymology is in the same language. Is this boring? I feel like I'm being boring here. Cyrus sends them home. Ezra and Nehemiah write about being home, about rebuilding the wall and rebuilding the temple. Micah and Nehemiah write about how we need to raise money to rebuild these things. Micah says we need to do justice, right? This is what it means to be Jerusalem. The through line through all of these, which I'll put at the end of this lecture again, is what do we want Jerusalem to be? Do we want Jerusalem to be a place for Jews where no one else should be here but Jews? And so that the way that we are our best self is to shut ourselves off from the world? Or do we want Jerusalem to be the place that is the holy mountain where everyone comes to learn about our God? And you see this play out in every single prophet. They have the same debate over and over again. As I was reading about Israel and Palestine again this week, it hits me again. As I read about what the North Carolina state legislator and the national House of Representatives are doing and not doing, I think again, what do we envision America to be? A place insular, where the American dream is for the rich and no one else? Or is it a place where we want more people to come, right? And if we let more people come, they will change us. And so are we afraid of that, or are we embracing that? How do we find our truest identity? It is not an easy question. Borders, who is in and who is out, saying even for a church, all are welcome, no exceptions, is a complicated thing to do. But it's still the right thing to do, so we're going to keep doing it, even though it's really, really hard. This is one of the questions that comes up in season 5, in Ezra and in Nehemiah. And when Billy Ray Cyrus goes all the way up to Greece, he starts to fight the Greeks, the Battle of Marathon, the Battle of the 500 at the gates, right? All of that happens, and then this guy, Alexander the Great, have you heard of him before? Alexander the Great says, enough's enough. He's actually really young when he takes over, but he basically never loses a battle. So people start calling him great. He probably had some really good generals who don't get credit for them. Season 6 is called The Greeks Are a Bunch of Jerks. And not like the hurricanes are a bunch of jerks, but actually they're really cool. The Greeks are actually a bunch of jerks. They reverse all of the rules of Cyrus, who said you can speak your language, you can have your religion, you can do these things. Alexander the Great is played by Lin-Manuel Miranda, who says that his country is young, wealthy, and a bit of a know-it-all, and they are here to conquer you. They have decided that they're going to make you better by making you like them. They change the official language of the world from Aramaic to Greek, and it takes a lot of the world spoke Greek for hundreds of years, right? Obviously, just as a note, we rarely talk about what we call the Far East in any of our biblical stories. It's not that they're not doing great things. They're not apropos to this conversation, but it is worth mentioning that there are millions of people living in the Far East. There are millions of people living in North and South America. That's not germane to our story, but they are there at the same time. But for this known world, Alexander the Great conquers all of it. It is a huge empire. The Persians had a huge empire. The Persians are modern-day Iran, and the Greeks go from Europe, and they really spread out. And this Alexander the Great guy is really good at conquering people. He's also pretty darn brutal. He tells the Hebrew people that they can no longer be circumcised, which is a big deal for them. Then he can prove whether or not they've been circumcised, because all men now report to the bathhouses, which is a sort of an invasion of privacy. The Greeks had relationships between men and boys that don't pass our moral standards. The Greeks brought their religion, their plays. Remember Sophocles, right? Do you remember reading the Iliad and the Odyssey? They brought their version of democracy, but it was all centered in Greece. Right? Have you ever heard anyone complain about taxation without representation? It becomes a problem, right? The thing that Alexander the Great is great at, other than winning, is starting cities called a polis. That word polis makes its way into the word Indianapolis, right? It also means the police, right? The police comes from the word polis. It also comes from the way that we vote. On Tuesday, get out and vote. Your community needs you to vote. Affordable housing is something that's really important for us. We need to vote, 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 vote. On Tuesday, this place will be a poll. All of those words come from that Greek word polis. And here's what he does, which is quite genius. Rather than going to cities and making them become more Greek, he finds good land where there ought to be cities, and he builds them, and then he forces people to move there. A city called Alexandria, for instance, in Egypt, started by Alexander the Great. He starts about 20 cities. And then he takes people from Samaria, he takes people from Babylon, he takes people from Jerusalem, he takes people from Cairo, and he moves them to one of his cities, Alexandria. He makes them all speak Greek because they don't speak the same language, and by doing so, he's eradicated their religion, he's eradicated their military threat, because now they're all living in his cities, paying his taxes, speaking his language, and having his place. It's pretty masterful, except he's a jerk. It's a jerk move, but it works. That's the world. I think Lin-Manuel Miranda could write the heck out of this story. I'm just saying, my next vote is that we not throw away our shot at world domination. I think that, I don't know what he's working on. It's probably Disney, but if he's not, Lin-Manuel Miranda, if you're watching this, Alexander the Great, okay? My name is Alexander the Great. I mean, it already writes itself, okay? This is season 6. Questions about season 6. I'm going to shift to the book of Daniel now, that I believe is written in season 6, even though the people who put the Bible together will tell you it's written in season 4. Because there are 3 different communities whenever you're reading Scripture: the age in which it was written, the age it was written about, and the age of you that's reading it. And we have only read that first verse, and it says, in the time of King Nebuchadnezzar, and the readers of the Bible don't use their big brains, they use their small brains and say, oh, it's in the time of King Nebuchadnezzar, let's put it back there in the Bible with the major prophets, with Isaiah, with Jeremiah. No, it doesn't belong there, and I can prove it. Daniel is a gorgeous, hilarious, powerful story if you read it in its context of the Greek Hellenistic world and not in the context of the story in which it is written, which is the Babylonian context. It is a season 6 text, and I will die on that hill. Daniel is a superhero. This is a comic book. This is a story of resistance of the empire. This is Star Wars. Daniel is awesome. Best name ever. Why does he write it in the time of the Babylonians? I'll tell you. Because one of the other things Alexander the Great also didn't like was to be challenged. So you can't write your comic book about how Daniel is Jewish, how Daniel is great, how Daniel is powerful, how Daniel can't be stopped by lions, which, by the way, don't exist in the Middle East. They exist in the Colosseums of the Greeks and the Romans, who take Jewish people, put them in the Colosseum for sport, and watch them die. Daniel is a subversive tale about how the empire is not better than us. And how if we are just faithful to our God, we can win. Daniel is a freedom pamphlet meant to stir up the Jewish people to revolt against the Greeks. But you can't mention Alexander by name. So you say King Nebuchadnezzar. Daniel existed in the time of King Darius. Daniel existed in the time of King Cyrus. You'll see these king names thrown around willy-nilly in the wrong order. And you can either say, these people don't know their history, or you can say, it doesn't matter which king's name we put here. We're really talking about the Greeks and how we are smarter and better and more cunning and stronger than they are. I think this is a super cool story. I'm excited to tell you about it. Okay, Daniel shows up in 2 different languages. Now use your big brain. Let's think about that. Did somebody start it in Hebrew and then decide to write in Aramaic and then decide to write in Hebrew again? Say no. No. Somebody wrote it in Hebrew and the middle was destroyed. And so then they wrote it in Aramaic so that the Greeks wouldn't think it was a Hebrew text. Subversive. When we found the Dead Sea Scrolls, remember, the Dead Sea Scrolls we found, I'm going to mess this up, 1940, let's say, 1950, probably, okay? When we found them, we've had Bibles for a long time, okay? But those Bibles, the oldest copy of every Bible we had was from about the year 200. And so we found the Dead Sea Scrolls, and they were from like the year 60 or 70, like 30 years after Jesus died, and all of their scrolls nearly matched identically what we had in the year 200. We were ecstatic, right? Like, that would have been really tough for us if the Dead Sea Scrolls had a bunch of stuff that we didn't have, right? And things had changed over, 150 years of rewriting it. For instance, we have this thing called the Pledge of Allegiance that under God was added in the 1960s. How many of you know that history? It existed long before it said under God. But if you don't do that research, you would just assume under God has been there the whole time, right? Right? But it hasn't. If you don't know how good your editing is, you don't know how good the document is that you have. The book of Daniel, when we found it in the Dead Sea Scrolls, started in Hebrew, switched to Aramaic, and kept up with Hebrew again, which is super cool because it matches, we have verifiable evidence of that. Okay, in the first chapter of Daniel, which is the only one we're going to look at extensively here because I want you to use your brain and read it, Daniel and his friends have been brought into the, let's say, Babylonian Empire, okay? This is to make fun of the Greeks, and I'm going to show that to you. Chapters 2 through 7 mirror each other. So 2 and 7, and then 3 and 5, 6, and then 4 and 5. They kind of mirror each other. It's like a V, but where they kind of step down and together, okay? And so these middle stories of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and Daniel in the lion's den are basically the same story, told 2 different ways. Okay? And then in the middle of it, you have kings who get their comeuppance. And in the beginning of it, in 3 and 2 and in 7, Daniel is interpreting dreams in 2 and in 7. 6 and 7. See, again, the people who put our chapters together don't really know what they're doing either. And so they cut things up in a way that they shouldn't, which is why I'm struggling to tell you what chapter things are in. But the structure exists. It just doesn't fit our number system, which was added much later. And then 8 through 12, Daniel's a professional visionary. 8 through 12. And he talks about trying to explain why the Jewish people are still suffering even after Cyrus returned them to their homeland. Essentially, coming up with a theology for why they were promised to return. It was good for a while under King Cyrus of Persia, and then it was bad under Alexander the Great. Here's what I need you to know about Daniel. This will be on the exam. He's been there for 1,000 years as a superhero. I know that's hard for you to imagine that the same character who's a superhero could show up multiple times by multiple people. I know this is a completely foreign, difficult idea for you to switch in your mind over and over again who the superhero is and how the superhero changes depending on who's leading them. I mean, if this happened for us, it would be so dumb. It would be hard for us to mentally prepare ourselves for a new superhero. And someday, if that were ever to happen to us, somebody would be stupid enough to put them all in the same movie. You get this idea, right? We know that the Val Kilmer Batman is not like the George Clooney Batman, right? That the Daniel Craig version of 007 is nothing like Pierce Brosnan, who's the weakest of all of them. That's not up for debate. We know that these Spider-Mans are very different, and if you haven't seen this movie where they're all in it, it's one of the greatest gems of the 21st century. I think you need to go back and see it. The way that they weave together all 3 of them in the same space is gorgeous. It's one of the greatest pieces of cinema of all time. That's not for debate either. But I'm showing you all this to tell you, Daniel is a Ugaric superhero. He's a folk tale from 1,000 years. He always wins. He's always like spurring things along. And what's different about this version of Daniel that you have is that he's Jewish. We don't know how often he was Jewish, but having him be Jewish changes his challenges. Having him be Jewish changes things. Now, there's a bunch of kids out there who've never known Daniel any other way. Just like my kids think of the genie in Aladdin as Will Smith. My kids also think that many of our founding fathers were people of color because of Hamilton, which, frankly, I got no reason to change that, right? All right? This is one superhero over 1,000 years' time. But in ours today, he's Jewish. Another thing I need to tell you about superheroes, and I'm sorry, this is going to change the way you watch these movies, but I need you to know this. So it's basically 2 versions of a superhero, okay? One, they're a flawed being who has to go on their hero journey and learn to be a moral being with superpowers. Okay? That's Iron Man. Then there's another kind of superhero who has to get the world to change because they have superpowers and they're moral beings. This is Wonder Woman. This is Captain America. This is Superman. Okay? Batman, hero's journey. Superman always does the right thing. Here's the problem. It's hard to make a good movie to try and get the world to change. It's more interesting, it's more identifiable for us if our superheroes are also really dark. If you like that kind of thing, you should watch The Boys on Amazon Prime. It's one of the greatest, darkest shows of all time, and I'm here for it. Anybody else seen The Boys on Amazon Prime? What do y'all do with your lives? Seriously. What are you, like, out in nature or something? Smokey and the Bandit. All right. Cool. There are two different kinds of superheroes. Are you with me on this point? In the second Wonder Woman, they tried to make her tell lies, and it was stupid. Anybody watch Wonder Woman 1984 and think it was a stupid movie? It's because they didn't understand that the character they had made wasn't that story. It doesn't work. In the second Captain America, they have him fall out of grace with the American government, and it doesn't work. Because they're trying to ascribe some moral code, but they cannot articulate that they've ruined their character. You can't make Captain America the leader of the Avengers because he's boring. You can't make Superman the leader of the show unless he's also Clark Kent. Have I ruined these movies for you? Sorry? Not sorry. You can do it once. That's my thesis. You can't make a sequel if the whole point is to change the world. Daniel is like Wonder Woman. Daniel is a superhero who does all the right things, and he's trying to change the world around him. Once I realized that I was going to say this to you, I got really excited because this is the story of Daniel. I'm going to do it right, and it uplifted the Jewish people to know that it was the Jewish person who was doing everything right throughout the book of Daniel. Daniel and his friends are heroes who make the world conform to them and to their following of their God, which is right and righteous. On the left, you know, I hope, the story of Daniel and the lion's den. And on the right, you see the very true historical version of some vegetables thrown into a furnace. How many of you know the Veggie Tales about the Book of Daniel? More people know that than any superhero. The bunny, yeah, I love the bunny. I don't love my mom or my dad, just the bunny. Who knows that? Anybody else? All right, good. Veggie Tales. These two stories are the pivotal scenes in the book of Daniel. All right, put your brains on. Let's read this as adults who know how to read things and not sit back in passive mode of be like, here are the scriptures. Okay, put your brains on. In the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it, and the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the articles from the temple of God. These he carried off to the temple of his God in Babylon. The word is Chaldean, that's what they call themselves, and put in the treasures the house of his God. That's going to come up later. Is the writer really upset about this? Doesn't sound like it. In fact, theologically, what has he said about the sacking of Jerusalem? The Lord delivered King Jehoiakim. Would Ezekiel write it that way? Would Jeremiah write it that way? Would Isaiah write about it that way? Would anybody living through it write about it that way? No. To be a Jew and to write it this way suggests a lot of time. Somebody say, yes, you understand that. You can look at this and say, wow, he's not personally invested in this, okay? He's not writing about 9/11. He's writing about Pearl Harbor. Do you get this? Yeah? Yeah, you with me on this? Okay, great, because we're going to keep going. Then the king ordered a chief of the court of the officials, I cut out his name, you don't need any more names, to bring in the king's service some of the Israelites, young men without any physical defect. That's a very Jewish thing, right? The lamb is supposed to be the one without blemish, the one without any physical defect. Handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, and that's a little redundant, right? Aptitude, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. He was to teach them the language and the literature of the Babylonians. The king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. The chief official gave them new names: to Daniel, Belteshazzar; to Hananiah, Shadrach; to Mishael, Meshach; and to Azariah, Abednego. He gave them Babylonian names. Okay? But Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine. He asked the chief of the officials for permission not to defile himself. Essentially, the superhero is going to become more Jewish than everyone else. It's going to be more kosher than everyone else. The king would then have the king will have my head because of you. I cannot give you permission to defile yourself. Daniel then said to the guard, please test your servants for 10 days. Your servants meaning me and my friends. Give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink. None of your wine, none of your pork. We're going to be only Jewish. Right? Do you get that feeling of Popeye the sailor, right? I'm only going to eat spinach here. Yeah, canned. Then compare our appearance with the young men who eat the royal food. And at the end of the 10 days, they looked healthier and better nourished than any of the young men who ate the royal food. This is a story of how the Jewish people, by being more Jewish, are stronger than the Babylonians and stronger than the Jews in Babylonian captivity who started eating pork, who started drinking their wine. You see what I'm saying? Yeah? This is a subversive story about your Jewishness being your strongest trait. Then these 4 men, God gave knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning, and Daniel could understand visions and dreams of all kinds. At the end of the time set by the king to bring them into his service, the chief official presented them to Nebuchadnezzar, the king. The king talked with them, and they found none equal to Daniel, Hananiah, and Mishael. Which names did they use here? Their Hebrew names or their Babylonian names? Their Hebrew names. He didn't call them Belteshazzar, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. The author is telling you that their truest sense of self is their Jewish self. Do you see this? Yeah. He found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in his whole kingdom. Your Jewishness is your superpower. And Daniel remained there until the first year of King Cyrus. All right. King Cyrus is the king of Persia who conquered the Babylonians. Is that story well represented here? No, it just simply suggests that after King Nebuchadnezzar came King Cyrus, which cuts out about 4 kings and cuts out the fact that one civilization conquered another one. These people are either really bad at history, or they're doing it because the names of the kings don't matter, and they're subverting their story in their Jewish Greco context, their Hellenistic context where the Greeks are in charge. They're subverting their story in some bad history. This is political satire. Once you understand the genre, the story shows up in 3D. Then Nebuchadnezzar said, this is the end, okay? The story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego is the same thing as Daniel in the lion's den. They're going to kill him if they keep worshiping their God. They say, Daniel, what should we do? He goes, worship your God, you'll be fine. They worship their God. The officials are like, they broke the rules. They worship that Hebrew God. We're going to throw them in the fire, into the furnace. They didn't worship the bunny. Throw the vegetables in the furnace. They do not get burned up. They actually sing a hymn of praise, which doesn't show up in our Protestant Bibles, but is in the Catholic Bibles. We've edited this book of Daniel for some reason. They sing, and at the end, the king, Nebuchadnezzar, says, praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who have seen his angel and rescued his servants. They trusted in him and defied the king's command and were willing to give up their lives rather than serve or worship any god except their own God. This is a story of the Maccabean revolt to stand up to the Greeks and overthrow their overlords. This is a story to get people revved up for battle. Do you see that? Yeah, I love this story. Daniel also interprets dreams. And there's a fun fact, this will be on the exam, that comes from the book of Daniel, a common phrase that you didn't know probably came here. And it's called, the writing is on the wall. The king has a dream that he's going to be beheaded, and that a hand appears in his dream that names kings and kingdoms that are going to be destroyed. And he says, Daniel, interpret my dream. And Daniel says, the writing's on the wall. What is there will happen. The king didn't want to hear that. By the way, that list of kings, completely made up. Not historical, doesn't have to do with anything really. Sometimes the kings are animals in Daniel, sometimes they're actual people. But the point is that they're showing up as political satire, right? Because Shakespeare writes Julius Caesar doesn't make that a historical document. The people in his day knew that he was writing a historical play. That doesn't make it true. It doesn't make it historical. Not really even trying to. He's making it more interesting. All the best stories deserve to be exaggerated. In Daniel, it takes someone who understands the Jewish God to interpret the dreams and see the future. Then the story of Daniel in the lion's den ends about the same way as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Daniel prays to his God, even though the fools who work in the king's court convince the king to outlaw the Jewish religion, and then they watch Daniel pray in defiance of the world where they're not allowed to pray to their God, which didn't happen in the Babylonian time, didn't happen in the Persian time, only happens when the Greeks rule. And in it, they say, well, now we have to throw you into the lions. Where did they get lions from? Everyone in that world would know. Lions come from these people who kill people for sport, who pack giant coliseums full of people who kill people for sport. This is a tangent, but it's a really interesting one. I went to the Colosseum in Rome last summer, and you can go like under the stage and all that. And while I'm standing there, I did yell as loud as I could, "Are you not entertained?" Because I just felt like I had to. And sent the video to my kids who were thoroughly embarrassed. But there was this is a true story from the Colosseum. One time, they brought in a whale, a dead whale, a huge dead whale. And they put it in the middle of the Colosseum, in the middle of the arena. Then they sliced it open, and live bears came out of it. That is pretty extravagant, okay? I'm not here for that. Well, I'm telling you, if I lived in that day, I would have been there, okay? I don't know what to tell you. Like, that sounds like quite the spectacle. Is it horrible? Yes. Is it hard for us to rejudge theirs? They don't have, they don't even have superhero movies. Like, what do they do for fun? They put bears inside of a whale and cut it open, okay? These are these people. The story of Daniel in the lion's den is a story about following your God in a world where they might actually throw you to the lions, which is something that they were doing to Jewish people in other parts. So listen to the end of Daniel. Daniel's story of Daniel in the lion's den from chapter 5. Then Belshazzar, which, by the way, is another king that doesn't follow immediately after Nebuchadnezzar, but again, we're telling bad history, so it doesn't matter. Daniel was clothed in purple. A gold chain was placed around his neck, and he was proclaimed the third highest ruler in the kingdom. That very night, Belshazzar, king of the Babylonians, was slain, and Darius the Mede took over for him at the age of 62. This is literally the worst history that's ever been told. Darius is the king who comes after Cyrus. But Cyrus isn't mentioned here. Cyrus was mentioned earlier. This is king number 4, who was followed by Cyrus, not Darius, historically. But here, Belshazzar is followed by Darius, who's king of the Medes, which makes no sense whatsoever. And the person who wrote this knew it. They knew it. They knew that Margaret Thatcher wasn't the Queen of Sheba. But that's how he wrote it. That's how he wrote it. Why would he do that unless he was doing it to show you it doesn't matter who's in charge? Your Jewishness is stronger, more clever, more cunning, more ability to see the future. Your belief in God is stronger than their gods, no matter how great their stories are. Your faith will make you strong. Your diet will make you strong. Your resistance will make Israel strong against the Greeks. This is a subversive superhero story that was meant to cause a rebellion. And that's exactly what happened. That's why I'm so sad that the story isn't told that way. You've never heard this before, have you? The story of Daniel's never been told the way that it ought to be. I think we can prove that those kings aren't even meant to be historical. They're playing so fast and loose. Darius, king of the Medes, makes no sense. The Medes live way over there. Darius is clearly the king of the Persians. Like, they did it because you're not allowed to talk bad about the Greeks. This is a secret story of hope. To fight back against the Greeks and later the Romans. This and then next week we're going to talk about Jonah, which is also a very late text. Esther also belongs here. The story of Esther is how the king, very much like Daniel, the king of, let's say Babylon, brings in, I think it's Persia actually, brings in all the most beautiful women in the entire world, and he falls in love with Esther because Jewish women are the most beautiful in the world. And then Mordecai and Esther subvert the social system from within. They bring her along because of her beauty, but it's actually her brains that wins the day. It is very similar to the book of Daniel. They are both very late stories. By the way, using your brains, the idea that this was written this way means that not only did it happen, right? They didn't make up the name Darius, but that it happened long enough ago that we could claim he's the king of the Medes, right? This text suggests that they're on purpose putting the wrong kings in the wrong places, and it suggests a much later date. How can you write about Darius if we put it in the Bible next to Ezekiel? Darius hadn't even been born yet. So, I just get fed up with these people who put together the Bible. They didn't read it. I don't know what to tell you. They just didn't read it. And I think what's really sad about that is the Hebrew Bible already existed in its order, which had Esther way later. And the Christians decided we can improve on your organizational structure that's lasted a few hundred years by reading the first topic sentence of every book and placing them in that order. I mean, the hubris of Christians, it's a little concerning. This is a story of hope. This is a story of rebellion. This is a story of a superhero who shows us that we have power too. This is a story about how superheroes with superpowers should not be just on a hero's journey. They should bend the world to match the ethos of God. I love this story. And it bears the question, what do we want Jerusalem to be? What do we want America to be? How do we want to tell our stories in a way that impact the world in which we live for the good of all? You know what's really cool about this story of Daniel is that it worked. Those children who grew up with this comic book of Daniel, of how Daniel was the most Jewish, secretly learned their Hebrew stories, in secret learned their Hebrew language, in secret wrote messages to each other in Hebrew that survived, and they were able to coordinate a secret rebellious revolt that is not in most Bibles, but it is in mine. And it's called 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Maccabees, when the Maccabees took the stories of Daniel. By the way, Daniel fights a dragon in mine. And they changed their own fate. They fought back against the evil Greeks. After Alexander the Great, his sons are like not great. So that's awkward. And one of them gets put in charge of this area, and they fight back and they win. And when they win, they take back their temple where the Greeks have been slaughtering pigs on their altar. And when they take back their temple, they find one jar of olive oil. And it's going to take 7 days to make more. And guess what? That one jar lasted 8 nights. This is a story of fighting for good. It's a story of hope in an age of darkness. It's a story of following God until the world bends to God's will. And it all starts with the best name ever, the Book of Daniel. Thanks for coming. Next week we're going to talk about Jonah. That one's going to be a lot of fun too. I hope you can come back, and we'll see you next week.